Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Let me begin by saying that universities are built on sovereign Aboriginal lands. Our university, Western Sydney, operates on the lands of the Darug, Tharawal, Eora and Wiradjuri nations. And I personally am joining you today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here. I remind myself and all of us that whatever country we are on, these always were and always will be Aboriginal lands. I try to incorporate a critical reflection on my own role as a migrant settler on Gadigal lands, the benefits that accrue to me as a result, and how I can use these spaces like today's lecture to question why things are the way they are. So having said that, I'd like to thank the Institute for Culture and Society for inviting me to give this lecture today on racial capitalism. I may have gone a little overkill in my preparation, as is my wont. So it might take the full hour, but I think we then have half an hour for questions. If you like, I'd encourage you to go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and turn on the closed caption, because maybe some of the terminology that I'm using could be new for some people. I'm not sure, but it just might help in following along. I personally find it quite accessible when I do that. So this lecture is a general overview of the theory of racial capitalism. So it doesn't do everything that it could do, far from it. It's really just the tip of the iceberg. Over recent years, as Charisse Burden-Stelly has remarked, racial capitalism has, quote, ascended across the humanities and social sciences. It has arisen as a conceptual framework to understand the mutually constitutive nature of racialization and capitalist exploitation on a global scale, in specific localities, in discrete historical moments, in the entrenchment of the carceral state, and in the era of neoliberalization and permanent war, end quote. Now, many people have identified the concept with the work of Cedric Robinson in his book, Black Marxism, which, although published in 1983, gained prominence really only after his death in 2017. It might be said that in the context of the Trump presidency, a growing dissatisfaction with analyses of race based on identity rather than on more material concerns also contributed to the popularization of racial capitalism as a sort of framing concept. Racial capitalism is also a good framework for some of the central concerns of Indigenous peoples under settler colonialism in Australia, North and South America, or Palestine, as the centrality of land fits well with the emphasis in racial capitalism on themes of dispossession, exploitation, and extraction. As Jody Melamed has written, accumulation under capitalism is necessarily expropriation of labor, land, and resources. Also, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore highlights, growing attention to the racialized injustices of the carceral system in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement is also served by the lens of racial capitalism. Racial capitalism, according to Gilmore, is a technology of anti-relationality. In other words, it works to reduce collective life to only the relations that allow neoliberal capitalism to function. According to Melamed, this means that different forms of humanity are separated or partitioned in order to better serve who can relate and under what terms. So we can see that racial capitalism severs human interrelationship and the connection between humans, the lands, the waters, and other sentient beings. It potentiates us for service to capitalist accumulation rather than for the collective enrichment of ourselves in symbiosis with the earth. As such, it is an excellent framework, I think, for understanding some of the most pressing problems that face us today. First and foremost, climate disaster. However, it does so by enabling us to understand the racialized dynamics of this crisis, birthed as it is in Western domination over and extraction from the majority of the Earth's surface, wrested from the hands of its Indigenous custodians. Now, these problems are actually beyond the scope of this lecture, but I am mentioning them here in order to emphasize why I think that racial capitalism is such a generative framework. And today I'm going to be presenting a much more narrow account, albeit long, focusing on the origins of racial capitalism and some of the debates that it has generated. So first, I'm going to make some introductory remarks about what racial capitalism is and what it is not, based on Gargi Bhattacharya's work in her book, Rethinking Racial Capitalism. Then I'll ground the origins of racial capitalism in the work of South African anti-apartheid Marxists. Third, I introduce Cedric Robinson's analysis of racial capitalism in Black Marxism. Then, via discussion of the gaps in Marxist thought on the centrality of race to capitalism, I discuss Stuart Hall's formulation of the relationship between race and class. This discussion is particularly useful, I think, because the notion that either class comes first or race does is a debate that continues to animate activists today, leading, I think, to considerable unproductive disagreements. Fifth, building on Burden Stelly's writing, I look at the particularity of racial capitalism in the United States as theorized by Black radical scholars such as Oliver Cromwell Cox, W.E.B. Du Bois, Claudia Jones, George Jackson, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, whose focus on the superexploitation of Black women was a precursor, Claudia Jones's work was a precursor to intersectionality theory. Sixth, I emphasize the centrality of settler colonialism as the context for the elaboration of racial capitalism, using Aileen Morton Robinson's work on the white possessive, alongside other theorists' work on property and dispossession. And lastly, I consider one of the most pressing areas in which a racial capital analysis is clarifying the role played by so-called essential workers who, quote, clean the world, as Françoise Vergès has remarked. What has COVID taught us about what Burden Stelly calls the gap between value and worth when it comes to the lives of mainly poor and negatively racialized people? As the historian Robin Kelly has remarked, there is no such thing as non-racial capitalism. All capitalism is racial. For Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis Nikhil Pal Singh, racial capitalism calls itself simply capitalism at the moment at which it becomes global. But until this point, there is actually an implicit understanding of its racialized roots. For the geographer and activist, abolitionist activist Ruth Wilson Gilmore, it is important to think of the spatialized nature of racial capitalism and its global dynamics, as she briefly explains here.
Racial capitalism, which is to say all capitalism, is not a thing, it's a relation. However, if we look back through the history of capitalism as it developed, we see that the understanding that those who own the means of production had of their differences from those whose labor they exploited were understandings that we can recognize today as racial practice. So, all capitalism is racial from its beginning, which is to say the capitalism that we have inherited that is constantly producing and reproducing itself. And it will continue to depend on racial practice and racial hierarchy, no matter what. This is another way of saying we can't undo racism without undoing capitalism.
So although capitalism can be said to be racial, according to Gargi Bhattacharya, this is not actually inevitably the case. Rather, speaking about all capitalism as being racial capitalism speaks to the historical fact that capitalism and modern racism developed along what Bhattacharya calls one axis of coincidence. Sorry, somebody's on the phone. Sorry, could you mute? Thank you. Capitalism is not inevitably racialized, but it did develop during the period of what she calls the racialized demarcation of the world, and contemporary capitalism is still racialized. Economic exploitation and racist othering often amplify each other. Racial capitalism is not an analysis of how different racialized groups are treated differently. That's the kind of issue that's attended to by, sociological studies of racial disparities in discrete settings like employment, housing, education, health, and so on. In contrast, racial capitalism, according to Bhattacharya, conceptualizes how the world made through racism shapes patterns of capitalist development. So what is racial capitalism not, according to Bhattacharya? Well, first, racial capitalism is not a call to diversify capitalism or corporate representation, like in the picture here. In fact, diversity is what Bhattacharya calls a veneer of capitalism in our times. She says we can see that capitalism, and by this I mean racial capitalism, is quite capable of presenting diversity as a business good. As the Black radical scholar Joy James has said in regard to the election of Kamala Harris as Vice President of the United States, we must remember, quote, that empires thrive on violence and racial capitalism, whether or not there are, quote, Black faces in high places. Second, racial capitalism is not necessarily Western, and it can exist in former colonies, for example, in South Africa under African leadership. As William Shoki has demonstrated in South Africa, for example, 10% of the country owns 90% of its wealth, and carrying the legacy of apartheid, these disparities are highly racialized. What Bhattacharya refers to as the ascent of brown or yellow capitalism does not mean that racial capitalism has been overcome. It just means that some elites in what used to be thought of as developing countries have been elevated and enjoy disproportionate wealth. So in this section, I'm going to discuss the South African roots of the idea of racial capitalism. So the concept of racial capitalism originates with the book Foreign Investment and the Reproduction of Racial Capitalism in South Africa, written by white South African Marxist scholars, Martin Legasik and David Hempson. And it was published by the London-based anti-apartheid movement in 1976. Legasik and Hempson used the concept of racial capitalism to critique South African liberals who argued that apartheid was a dysfunctional aberration of capitalism that could be abolished through the improvement and better organization of South African capitalism, a position that Peter Hudson remarks was shared by many white South African capitalists, by Henry Kissinger and the US State Department, and by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, the context for the theorization of racial capitalism in South Africa was the growing international boycott movement that was targeting South African exports. According to Arun Kundnani, those opposed to the boycott argued that only through increased industrialization and economic growth in South Africa would so-called racial prejudice melt away. This belief is grounded in a view of racism based on economic exploitation alone, a view which those who foreground racial capitalism oppose. Indeed, Legasik and Hempson argued that capitalist growth strengthened racism rather than weakening it. Now, other South African Marxist scholars used racial capitalism were Harold Walp, for example. Walp had been imprisoned for his activism against apartheid in 1963, but managed to escape spending 30 years in exile in the UK. Walp argued that Black workers in South Africa could be paid at below social reproduction costs because the costs of social reproduction were being met in the parallel subsistence economy. Apartheid was kept in place to prevent the formation of a stable urban proletariat and ensure continued sub-reproduction labor costs, as those who were unable to work could be deported to the Bantustans, and workers could not, therefore, they were not able to create stable families in the cities. Another prominent proponent of racial capitalism was Neville Alexander, an activist and academic from the Eastern Cape, who was involved in the Azanian People's Organization and other anti-apartheid organizations. For Alexander, a non-racial capitalism was impossible in South Africa. According to Peter Hudson, Alexander was against those who argued for the development of non-racialism or multiracialism in South Africa without first criticizing the underlying notion of immutable races and without at the same time understanding the political economic relations that shaped them. In his review essay on racial capitalism, Arun Kundnani states that these South African theorists of racial capitalism blew apart the common Marxist idea that the advent of capitalism supersedes the phase of so-called primitive accumulation. In other words, the idea that the capitalist mode of production spread from its European origins to overtake the entire globe. Rather, in South Africa, an urban industrialist white economy coexisted with a black rural non-capitalist economy. So the African subsistence economy was not outside of capitalism and destined to be dissolved by it in a process of dispossession and expulsion, as Kundnani puts it. Rather, the two economic structures were combined into a single structure. These theorists also shattered the Marxist idea that capitalism would lead to ancient and venerable prejudices being swept away, as Marx and Engels claimed in the Communist Manifesto, because as Legesick and Hempson claimed, in South Africa, racism actually increased the more advanced the capitalist economy became. Furthermore, the apartheid system was not actually a hangover from the 19th century, as many people assumed. It was a new capitalist state created in the 1940s. Racism in South Africa was not about manipulating the working class. It was, in fact, the basis for the economy. So in this section of the lecture, galloping through all of this stuff, I introduced the theorization of racial capitalism proposed by Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism. Before doing so, let me say a few words about Robinson himself. So Cedric Robinson was born on November the 5th, 1940, and grew up in a Black working class neighborhood in West Oakland, in California. He was active in radical student politics during his time at the University of Berkeley in the 1960s, and he got his PhD in 1974. In 1978, he joined the faculty of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and became director of Black Studies Research Center. Now, interestingly, as some of you may know, Robinson researched and wrote Black Marxism while living in Cambridge in the UK. He worked for the Institute of Race Relations, and activist intellectuals such as Ambalavanur Sivanandan, CLR James, who were all central in developing anti-racist strategy and theory in Britain. At a recent event that was organized by the Institute on the publication of Josh Meyer's intellectual biography of Cedric Robinson, Colin Prescott noted that Robinson's political development was enhanced by his many interactions with UK scholars and activists. So Black Marxism was published in the UK by Pluto Press in 1983, but it wasn't actually taught on US campuses, despite the fact that, as Robin Kelly notes in his preface to the new edition, in it, Robinson, quote, rewrites the history of the rise of the West from ancient times to the mid-20th century. So key contributing factors to the lack of attention that was paid to the book were as follows. Firstly, well, it had a UK publisher, not a US, maybe university press. Secondly, the separation of race-based from class-based analyses by those on both sides of the debate played a role. Robinson insisted that it was actually impossible to separate the two. And this key theme, I think, is currently being addressed in part due to the revival in interest in his book and racial capitalism more generally after his death. Thirdly, Black Marxism was also ignored by Eurocentric Marxist scholars and activists because of what Kelly calls the book's withering critique of Western Marxism. However, many have wrongly, I think, and others agree, assessed that that Robinson is opposed to Marxism. Rather, we could argue that, as Frantz Fanon said, Robinson suggests a stretched reading of Marxism. Fourthly, the central concern of Black Marxism is really a centering of Black thought. what Robinson calls the Black radical tradition, which he locates in the struggle of African descendant people against racism and in particular slavery. Black Marxism requires us to view the history of modernity from the standpoint of those who lost everything as a result of colonial domination and imperialism. As such, it is also a critique of Eurocentrism. As Robinson stated in his 1980 book, The Terms of Order, the history and development of Western institutions, Western social thought, is not merely ethnocentric, but epistemocentric as well. In this, Robinson's work is congruent with much critical indigenous scholarship that advances an epistemology that questions the universality of Western universalism. So, as Arun Kundnani notes, Robinson's thinking in Black Marxism can be thought of as building on the work of Black radical thinkers such as W.B. Du Bois, Oliver Cromwell Cox, C.L.R. James and Claudia Jones, among others, who had been thinking about the relationship between racism and capitalism for many years. Unlike the South African Marxists, who saw the South African case of racial capitalism as an exception to the rule of Marxist assumptions that capitalism precedes racism, Robinson thought actually, although he was greatly inspired by the South African racial capitalist theorists, he thought that the exception was the rule. Even in Western Europe, racial divisions of labor had existed, he thinks, throughout the history of capitalism. For Robinson, the starting point is feudalism, the antagonism of which formed the basis for a developing European civilization. From the early division between the Romans and the barbarians, the formation of Europe was based on exclusion. The question of labor comes in where those whom Robinson refers to as the vast majority of the barbarians, he gives the example of the North Africans, Italians, and Poles, came to metropolitan France in the late Roman Empire as migrant laborers, and they very quickly became assimilated as a slave labor force. Robinson remarks that it is also important to realize that with respect to the emerging European civilization, whose beginnings coincide with the arrivals of these same barbarians, slave labor as a critical basis of production would continue without any significant interruption into the 20th century. So this is about slavery continuing within Europe rather than where we think about it mainly happening, which is of course in the so-called New World. Importantly, it was not the advent of capitalism that brought about the end of slavery in European agrarian production. Satnam Virdi elaborates on the role of expanding Christianity in the development of intra-European racism, which Robinson saw as going hand in hand with the development of capitalism. For Virdi, the emergence of racism as a material force should be located in the social and political conflicts of what is commonly referred to as the transition period between a feudal order in terminal crisis and a bourgeois order struggling to be born. The first absolutist state, Spain, which was established in 1479, was critical. The conquistadores, who were sent by the Spanish monarchy to pillage the Americas in the subsequent decades, emerged from a social milieu that already understood themselves as battle-hardened warriors with a strong attachment to a racialized religious superiority rooted in the purity of their Christian descent, according to Virdi. The struggle of the Reconquista to wrest power back from Muslim rulers was key to this racialized division. The Iberian Christians found themselves ruling over a highly diverse population, including Muslims of many ethnicities and, of course, Jews. Many among the Muslims were, quote, an indispensable component of the rural workforce, and so were vital to ensuring the economic security of the newly conquered Christian lands. But they were also feared, according to Virdi, as a fifth column who could rebel at any time. According to Virdi, part of the response to the perceived threat from these potential Muslim rebels was selling them into slavery, their lands shared among Christian settlers, as was the case in 13th century Minorca and Ibiza. Virdi also makes it clear that as early as the 13th century, the Christian elite was closing down the possibility of accepting non-Christians via assimilation and conversion, as had been the case previously, with now sexual relations between Christians and Muslims and Jews being punishable via stoning to death. So from the early 12th century on, what later becomes known as the bourgeoisie emerges from the merchants, the merchant class, the mercati, who dealt in foodstuffs. As a result of population growth under feudalism, a greater number of people were detached from the land, and they became committed to a roving and hazardous existence. They were therefore seen as foreigners, and they were often former slaves or unfree laborers. Eventually, these people established ports in order to facilitate exchange between the Mediterranean, the East, and Northern Europe. According to Henri Pirenne, whose work Robinson cites, Europe colonized herself thanks to the increase in her inhabitants. People are then pushed from the land into the urban centers. For example, the Flemish cloth industry is completely transformed by the bourgeoisie into an urban manufacturer on the basis of capitalistic wage labor. The poor then flock to the urban centers due to the development of these industries. Serfs could become free by moving to the city, which conferred upon them the right of freedom. So the bourgeoisie initially freed the serfs in order to later re-enslave them, Robinson says. Now, it's at this point that international trade begins, with different goods coming from different areas and products from different regions of Europe. So, for example, wine from Italy, Spain, and France, wheat from England, and so on, becoming the major basis for international trade, along with wool and cloth. But the most profitable trade was in slaves. Between the 13th and the 15th centuries, most slaves were European and were mostly involved in domestic labor. But African slaves were starting to be used in Spain and in the Italian colonies of Crete and Palestine by Genoese and Venetian masters on sugar plantations and for work in mines. So slavery as a system, according to Robinson, evolves in Europe and largely retains the same structure. The difference, he says, is that the white victims of slavery were replaced by a much greater number of African Negroes, he says, captured in raids or brought by traders. As Verlinden makes clear, medieval colonial slavery served as a model for Atlantic colonial slavery. So for Robinson, then, it means that race actually takes shape in Europe, in that the enslavement of those excluded, first as barbarians and then as non-Christians, was intrinsic to the establishment of modern capitalism, and indeed sets the context for its development along racialized lines. This view contrasts with a much more widespread belief, such as that put forward by the Marxist sociologist Charlie Post, that it was, quote, only with the emergence of African slavery in late 17th century Virginia that race is crystallized. In fact, according to Robinson, in the so-called New World, although it is presumed that slavery of whites died out because of African slavery, indentured servitude from Ireland, Germany, and so on actually coexisted with African enslavement up until the American Revolution. In revolutionary America, the unfree, Robinson says, were divided into 5 categories: Negroes, white servants, women, minors, and propertyless white males. So indeed, Robinson traces what he calls racialism, which is the word he prefers over racism, back to the Middle Ages in Europe, when the nobility came to believe that they had, quote, better blood than peasants, who were seen as descendants of Ham. And this sets the precedent for Count Arthur de Gobineau's 19th century theorization of the racial superiority of the aristocracy. At this time, foreign mercenaries were used to fight wars, but also to suppress subject peoples. Armies were never made up of nationals, so that those who fell victim associated their tormentors with foreigners rather than with the rulers who had hired them to come and torment them. But migrant labor was also important in other spheres. Robinson remarks that there has never been a moment in modern European history, if before, that migratory and or immigrant labor was not a significant aspect of European economies. Each class, he said, had its different racial provenance. Slavs became the so-called natural slaves in the early Middle Ages, while the Tatar fulfilled this role in the later Middle Ages in the Italian cities. This demonstrates the polyvalent nature of racial ascription. Even while theorized as fixed, race is attached and reattached to different groups before negative racialization settles in the modern era, and still today, on Black and Indigenous peoples first and foremost. From the 12th century on, the bourgeoisie starts to initiate the myths of egalitarianism while seeking, Robinson writes, every opportunity to divide people for the purpose of their domination. So we have a kind of a paradox wherein Europe is based on racial division, but obscures this through mythical appeals to unity, which grow with the development of the myth of European civilization. One such myth, the German idea of Herrenvolk, or master race, becomes central in the 17th and 18th century. Race becoming largely the rationalization for the domination, exploitation,